Good evening, and welcome back to the Poe Museum. For tonight's video, I decided not to select an object. The object I profile will actually be chosen entirely at random. What will it be? You'll find out on tonight's installment of the Curator's Crypt. As you probably already know, the Poe Museum boasts thousands of pieces of Poiana. That's Edgar Allan Poe artifacts to you and me. And I've profiled over 100 of them. So I decided for this week's video to let an object pick itself. I did this by going to the Poe Museum's searchable online database and using the random images tool. So this selection could come from our library collection, photography collection, objects collection, or even our archives. So what do we choose? It's Poe, A Psychopathic Study by John Wooster Robertson. So here it is. This is the book. And first of all, that title, A Psychopathic Study, this was 1923, so there were already psychologists writing studies about Poe's mental health. And he references some of these. Soon there would be Marie Bonaparte, who did her pioneering work on Poe's mental health from a Freudian point of view. She was a student of Sigmund Freud. Now, this guy, John Wooster Robertson, he lived in California. He ran the Livermore Asylum, and it treated different mental illnesses. Before he got there, he specialized in the treatment of alcoholism. So a lot of his book has to do with diagnosing Poe with dipsomania, or obsession with drink. And he explains that a lot of what's considered mental illness in Poe is really just the side effects of his obsession with drinking. And this is sort of an old-fashioned diagnosis, but remember, this is 1923. And one of the things I wanted to show you here was the frontispiece. That's that painting. He was already, at this time, a friend of the Poe Museums. And he was there. This was 1923. It was the first anniversary of the museum's opening. One of our other founders, James H. Whitty, knew about his huge collection of Poe. He wanted to collect every single book that Poe had ever published, the first printings of all of Poe's works in every magazine or periodical where they showed up. And Whitty said, "Can you loan us some things from the museum?" And Robertson didn't respond at first, but then for the first anniversary, he heard that the museum was going to be placing a plaque on the grave of Poe's first ideal love. Jane Stanner, the woman Poe called the first purely ideal love of my soul. And Poe dedicated the poem to Helen to her. But Robertson decided the plaque should have a different poem other than to Helen, because in an early version of The Valley of Unrest called The Valley Niece, he mentions Helen and a grave covered with violets. So what does Robertson do? He shipped from California 100 violets to be planted all over her grave, all over the burial plot. There were too many to fit in the plot. So the founders of the museum had to ask, well, we can't fit all the flowers there. Can we take some home and plant them in our own garden? They might have even planted some here at the Poe Museum. But anyway, by that time, Robertson was really involved in what the Poe Museum was doing. And just a few years later, it's 1927, he gave us his prized first editions. We're talking Poe's second book, Al-Araf, his third book, Poems, the Conchologist's first book, the Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque, basically everything except for Tamerlane and the prose romances, which are the rarest of rare Poe books. He gave us those. And then a few years after that, he gave us the entire collection of his first printings. So the first printings of the big hits like The Cask of Amontillado, The Fall of the House of Usher, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, pretty much everything but, The Gold Bug, which is really difficult to find the first printing, and The Telltale Heart, which we were later able to get The Telltale Heart, but just not from him. So Robertson was fascinated with Poe. He said it all started one day in London. He was in a bookshop and he saw Mesmerism and Articula Mortis. And if you know Poe's stories, that's not the title of one of Poe's stories. That was actually a British bootleg copy in pamphlet form of Poe's story, The Facts in the Case of M. Valdemar, about a guy who's mesmerized just before he dies so he can keep his mind alive after his body's dead. So even after the body starts to decay and his tongue's this big black mass and he's shriveling up, he's still alive in there because he's in a mesmeric trance. And in London at the time, people thought it was a true story. There were actually still people still in the United States who didn't know better, who thought this was a true story. And even a mesmerist wrote to Poe and said, "This is true, isn't it? You're just pretending it's a hoax." So Robertson was hooked, and he wanted to know, how does this guy's mind work? So he started collecting as many first printings as he possibly could. So in addition to talking about Poe's dipsomania, he also talks about Poe's auto-mesmerism, or his auto-hypnotism. And that was sort of inspired by Poe's story Berenice, the tooth one. There was a guy, he goes into a trance, he digs up his wife's grave, he plucks out her teeth, all while in this trance state, this auto-hypnotism. And Robertson thought that Poe could write about that sort of thing because he'd experienced it somehow. And hypnotism was a big deal back in Poe's time because they believed, and even Poe wrote about this in one of his letters, that when you were in a trance state, you were free from your physical body. If you're free from your physical body, you're free from your physical eyes, so you can see spirits, you can see the other side. There was a famous trance medium from Poe's time called Andrew Jackson Davis, who would just go into a trance on stage and he'd start revealing what he could see. There's another world called Summerland, and he described all the people who used to be alive and their spirits are there in Summerland. So Poe wrote about some of these kind of things. He was interested in this early movement of spiritualism, which really got kicked off in 1848, a year before Poe's death. And Robertson here was a spiritualist, and he thought that Poe, in fact, was maybe a closet spiritualist, or maybe had powers. He actually describes him as having a sixth sense, that he could see beyond the average person's perception. So he thought that Poe had clairvoyant powers of some kind. And even people in Poe's lifetime, like Sarah Helen Whitman, who's one of his fiancées, seemed to think that Poe had these kind of clairvoyant powers. So that's sort of what Robertson writes about. And in addition to writing this, he also wrote a bibliography of Poe first printings, and he followed that with commentary of the bibliography. And sure, he gave those pieces to the Poe Museum too. But I like the inscription in this one. And he says, "With my compliments, John W. Robertson." That's not the good part. The good part's this one. "A study of the unknown, possibly the unknowable." And that's one of the great things about this. He's branching out beyond psychology to the paranormal, really trying to find out what made Poe tick. So you didn't think I could do a whole Curator's Crypt just about a randomly selected object, but I did. Well, if you'd like to select any random artifacts to have as profile, just let us know down in the comments. And if you'd like to help us preserve, protect, and present these priceless Poe pieces, why not become a patron or a member, or just make a gift at poemuseum.org. And until next time, thanks for joining us, and I'll leave you with more gratuitous footage of the Poe Museum cats doing Poe Museum cat stuff.